Hi, I'm Sophia Marchand. I'm a cardiac surgeon at Boston Medical Center. But that day, at my brother's swearing-in ceremony, my entire family laughed at me like I was some kind of failure. Have you ever been treated like the family disappointment? Like everything you've accomplished means nothing because it wasn't what they wanted for you? Well, sit tight, because what happened next changed everything. It was a crisp October morning in downtown Boston. The courthouse steps were buzzing with families dressed in their finest, all there to watch their loved ones get sworn in as attorneys. I sat quietly in the back row, wearing a simple black dress that I'd grabbed from my closet between surgeries. I'd driven straight from the hospital after finishing a 12-hour cardiac procedure, but nobody in my family knew that. As I walked through the courthouse lobby, I could hear the whispers following me like a shadow. "There's Sophia," my Aunt Margaret murmured to my cousin David, "the one who dropped out of Harvard Law." My Uncle Robert shook his head with that familiar look of disappointment. Such a waste, all that potential thrown away. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the marble floor, pretending I couldn't hear them. But when I passed my father near the entrance, he didn't even try to lower his voice. "At least one of my kids made it," he said to his business partner, gesturing toward the front of the courtroom where my brother Marcus stood adjusting his tie. Dad's eyes met mine for just a second, and in that glance, I saw everything I'd been seeing for the past 8 years: disappointment, embarrassment, and the kind of resigned shame parents feel when they think one of their children has failed. I found my seat in the very back, pulled out my phone, and tried to blend into the background. That's where I'd learned to exist in my family. Invisible, unnoticed, the cautionary tale they'd reference whenever someone else's kid made a questionable life choice. But here's the thing about being invisible. You see everything, you hear everything, and you remember everything. The ceremony began with the typical pomp and circumstance. Judge Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, called the proceedings to order. One by one, new attorneys stepped forward to take their oath. My brother Marcus looked sharp in his navy suit, his Harvard Law School pin gleaming on his lapel, the same pin I was supposed to be wearing. As I watched him raise his right hand and repeat the oath, my mind drifted back to 8 years ago, to the day that changed everything, the day my family started calling me a quitter. It was my 3rd week at Harvard Law School. I was sitting in the Langdell Library, buried under constitutional law textbooks, when I heard a commotion near the reference desk. An elderly man had collapsed, clutching his chest, his face turning blue. Students scattered, some pulling out phones to call 911, others standing frozen in shock. But something inside me kicked in, something that had nothing to do with tort law or criminal procedure. I dropped my books and ran to him. My hands found his wrist, checking for a pulse. Nothing. Without thinking, I positioned my hands on his chest and started compressions. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, I whispered to myself, falling into a rhythm I didn't even know I knew. "Come on, stay with me." It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before the paramedics arrived. They took over, shocked his heart back into rhythm, and loaded him onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him away, he grabbed my hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved my life." That night, I sat in my dorm room staring at my law books, but all I could think about was the feeling of that man's heartbeat returning under my hands. The next morning, I walked into the pre-med advisor's office and asked what it would take to switch my major. The conversation with my parents didn't go well. "You're throwing away Harvard Law School?" my mother had screamed over the phone. "Do you have any idea what this looks like? What people will say?" "We invested everything in your education," my father added when he got on the line. "Law school was your ticket to success, Sophia. Medicine? That's just playing doctor." My brother Marcus, ever the golden child, tried to be diplomatic. "Soph, I get it. You want to help people, but lawyers help people too. And let's be honest, some people just aren't cut out for the pressure of law school." That phrase, "some people just aren't cut out for it," became the family refrain. Every holiday, every family gathering, every phone call somehow circled back to my failure to stick with law school. They'd invested so much in the idea of having a daughter at Harvard Law that my actual happiness, my actual calling, became irrelevant. I switched to pre-med, graduated summa cum laude, and got into medical school. But at family dinners, I was still the Harvard Law dropout. I completed my residency in cardiac surgery, one of the most competitive specialties in medicine. But to my family, I was still the daughter who couldn't handle the pressure. Even today, sitting in this courtroom watching my brother's moment of triumph, I could feel the weight of their disappointment. My mother kept glancing back at me with that look, you know the one. The look that says, "This could have been you if you hadn't given up." After Marcus took his oath, Judge Harrison smiled and gestured for the families to come forward for photos. I stayed in my seat, watching as my parents beamed with pride, my aunts and uncles gathering around for pictures. This was Marcus's moment, and I was fine being the observer. But then something strange happened. As the crowd was settling down for the group photos, Judge Harrison suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He was looking directly at me, his eyes widening with what looked like recognition. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "Is that Dr. Marchand?" The entire room turned to look at me. My family's heads swiveled in unison, confusion written across their faces. I felt my cheeks burn as 200 pairs of eyes focused on the woman in the back row who was supposed to be invisible. But I knew that look in Judge Harrison's eyes. I'd seen it before, in the intensive care unit 2 years ago, when I'd worked 18 straight hours to repair the damage from his massive heart attack. He'd been unconscious for most of it, but afterwards, when he was recovering, I'd spent hours explaining his procedure, his medications, his road to recovery. "Oh my God," he continued, his voice filled with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a hero in our courtroom today." My father's hand holding the courthouse program began to shake visibly. My mother's breathing became shallow, her hand instinctively moving to her chest. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, still wearing his confident smile, but now looking completely lost. The judge continued, his voice growing stronger. 2 years ago, Dr. Sophia Marchand saved my life during emergency cardiac surgery. I had suffered a massive heart attack, the kind they call the widowmaker. And without her brilliant hands and quick thinking, I wouldn't be standing here today. The courtroom erupted in applause, but all I could focus on was the look on my family's faces. The same people who had spent 8 years calling me a failure were now staring at me like they were seeing me for the first time. My Aunt Margaret, who just minutes ago had been whispering about my wasted potential, was now applauding with tears in her eyes. My Uncle Robert, who had shaken his head in disappointment when I walked in, was now nodding with what looked like respect, or maybe shock, but it was my parents' reactions that hit me the hardest. My father, the man who had built his entire identity around success and achievement, was staring at me with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The courthouse program he'd been holding so proudly had fallen to the floor. My mother had gone completely pale, her breathing so shallow I was genuinely concerned she might need medical attention herself. She kept blinking rapidly like she was trying to process information that didn't fit with everything she thought she knew about her daughter. The judge wasn't finished. Dr. Marchand performed a quadruple bypass on me when 2 other surgeons said it couldn't be done. She spent 18 hours in that operating room, and then she personally monitored my recovery for weeks. She didn't just save my life. She gave me back my future. She gave me more time with my grandchildren. The applause continued, but I felt like I was watching everything through a fog. This wasn't how I had imagined this day going. I had come here to support my brother, to sit quietly in the back and avoid any family drama. I hadn't expected to be recognized. I certainly hadn't expected my family's entire perception of me to crumble in the span of 5 minutes. Judge Harrison gestured for me to stand, and reluctantly, I rose from my seat. The applause grew louder, and I could see people throughout the courtroom turning to get a better look at me. Some were taking pictures, others were wiping away tears. When I heard the name Marchand on today's swearing-in roster, the judge continued, I wondered if there might be a connection. "Dr. Marchand, is this young man your brother?" All eyes turned back to me. I could feel my family's stares boring into me, waiting for my response. Marcus, still frozen at the front of the room, looked like he was processing the fact that his failure sister was being celebrated by the presiding judge. "Yes, Your Honor," I managed to say, my voice barely carrying across the room. "Marcus is my brother." "Well then," Judge Harrison beamed, "this family has raised two remarkable children, one who fights for justice in the courtroom and one who fights for life in the operating room. You should all be very proud." The judge's words hit my family like a physical blow. My mother finally took a deep breath, but it came out as more of a sob. My father was still staring at me, his complexion now matching the gray of his suit. It was like watching people recalibrate their entire understanding of reality in real time. For 8 years, they had carried the narrative that I was the child who couldn't handle pressure, who had given up when things got tough, who had thrown away a prestigious opportunity for something lesser. But now, in this moment, they were being forced to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong about everything. As the ceremony concluded and families began to disperse, I remained standing in the back of the courtroom, overwhelmed by what had just happened. This was supposed to be Marcus's day, his moment of triumph. And somehow, it had become the day when my family finally learned who I really was. But the thing about being invisible for so long is that you get used to it. You get comfortable being underestimated, being overlooked, being dismissed. Part of me had almost preferred it that way. There's a strange freedom in having no expectations to live up to, no family pressure to maintain an image. Now, though, everything had changed. The secret I had been carrying, my real life, my real achievements, my real identity, was out in the open. And I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for what came next. The silence that followed Judge Harrison's revelation was deafening. As families began filing out of the courtroom, exchanging congratulations and taking photos, my family remained frozen in place. Marcus finally broke from his statue-like pose and began walking toward me, his face a mixture of confusion and something that might have been respect. "Sophia," he said when he reached me, his voice barely above a whisper. Is that all true? You really saved his life?" I nodded, still processing the surreal nature of the moment. 2 years ago, he had a massive heart attack during a routine court session. They brought him to Boston Medical, and I was the attending cardiac surgeon on call. My parents approached slowly, like they were walking through a minefield. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, and my father looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 10 minutes. "Honey," my mother started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what to say. "We had no idea. You never told us about any of this." I almost laughed at the irony. "When would I have told you? Every conversation we've had for the past 8 years has been about how I disappointed you by leaving law school. When exactly was I supposed to bring up my medical career?" My father cleared his throat, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. "But surely you could have mentioned that you had become so—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "So what, Dad? Successful? Accomplished? Worth being proud of?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but 8 years of being treated like a failure had built up a reservoir of hurt that was now spilling over. Judge Harrison, who had been watching our family drama unfold from a distance, approached us with a gentle smile. "Dr. Marchand, I hope you don't mind me saying, but your family seems surprised by your achievements. Don't they know about your work?" I felt my cheeks burn. "Your Honor, my family and we haven't been in close contact about my career. They've been focused on Marcus's success in law school." The judge's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, perhaps it's time they learned about yours. Dr. Marchand, would you mind if I shared a few things with your family? Things you probably haven't told them yourself?" I wanted to disappear, to sink through the marble floor of the courthouse. But something in Judge Harrison's kind eyes made me nod. "Dr. Marchand," he began, addressing my family directly. "Graduated valedictorian from medical school. She completed her residency in cardiac surgery, one of the most competitive specialties in medicine, at the top of her class. She's published research in the New England Journal of Medicine that has revolutionized how we approach certain cardiac procedures." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face had gone completely white. "But more than that," Judge Harrison continued. "She's saved hundreds of lives. The procedure she performed on me? 2 other surgeons said it couldn't be done. Dr. Marchand spent 18 hours in that operating room, refusing to give up. She's known throughout Boston Medical Center as one of the most skilled cardiac surgeons on the East Coast." Marcus was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Sophia, why didn't you ever tell us any of this? Why did you let us think—" "Let you think what?" I asked. "That I was a failure?" "Marcus, I tried to tell you about medical school, about my residency, about my work, but every conversation somehow became about how I couldn't handle law school, how I'd given up when things got tough. You made it clear that unless I was following the path you'd chosen for me, my achievements didn't matter. The truth was, I had stopped trying to share my successes with them years ago. When I graduated medical school summa cum laude, I'd called home excited to share the news. My father's response had been, "Well, it's not Harvard Law, but I suppose it's something." When I got into the cardiac surgery residency program, my mother had sighed and said, "I just wish you'd stuck with your original plan." After a while, it became easier to just let them believe what they wanted to believe. I built a life they knew nothing about, filled with colleagues who respected me, patients who trusted me, and achievements that mattered to me, even if they didn't matter to my family. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my department head, had called me 3 days ago to congratulate me on a particularly difficult surgery I'd performed. "Sophia," she'd said, "you saved that man's life when everyone else had given up. His family wants to meet you, to thank you personally. They're calling you a miracle worker." I had a wall in my office covered with thank you cards from patients and their families, letters that said things like, "Dr. Marchand gave me back my father," and "Because of Dr. Marchand, I'll walk my daughter down the aisle." But none of those letters mattered to the people standing in front of me now because they'd never bothered to ask about my life. Judge Harrison excused himself to attend to other families, but not before shaking my hand again and saying, "Dr. Marchand, it was an honor to have you here today. Your family should be incredibly proud of you." After he left, we stood in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. The courthouse was emptying out around us, other families heading to celebration dinners and photos, while we remained frozen in this moment of reckoning. "Sophia," my father finally said, his voice hoarse, "I think we need to talk, really talk. Would you come to dinner with us tonight? We're taking Marcus to celebrate, and we'd like you to join us." For a moment, I considered declining. Part of me wanted to walk away, to return to my life where I was valued and respected, where I didn't have to prove my worth over and over again. But another part of me, the part that had always hoped for their approval, nodded. "Okay," I said, "but I need to make something clear. I'm not the same person who left Harvard Law School 8 years ago. I'm not going to apologize for my choices anymore, and I'm not going to pretend that your disappointment in me didn't hurt." My mother reached out tentatively and touched my arm. "Honey, we want to understand. We want to know who you've become." 3 hours later, we sat around a table at Marcus's favorite restaurant, the same place where we'd celebrated his law school graduation, his passing the bar exam, his first job at a prestigious firm. But tonight felt different. Tonight, for the first time in 8 years, they were asking me questions about my life. "Tell us about the surgery," Marcus said, leaning forward. "The one you did on Judge Harrison. What actually happened?" I took a sip of wine and began to tell them about that night 2 years ago. It had been a Tuesday, around 11 p.m., when the ambulance brought Judge Harrison in. He'd collapsed during a late evening court session. Witnesses said he'd grabbed his chest and fallen forward onto his desk. When he arrived, he was in cardiogenic shock, I explained. His heart had stopped pumping effectively. The emergency room team had managed to get him stabilized, but barely. When I looked at his scans, I could see he had blockages in all 4 major coronary arteries. The left anterior descending artery, we call it the widowmaker, was completely blocked. My parents listened intently, hanging on every word. This was more than they'd heard about my work in the entire 8 years since I'd left law school. 2 senior surgeons looked at his case and said it was inoperable, I continued. The blockages were too extensive, his heart too weak. They recommended palliative care, basically making him comfortable while he died. "But you disagreed?" my mother asked. I disagreed, I nodded. I'd been researching a new technique, a combination of bypass surgery and arterial grafting that could potentially restore blood flow to areas other surgeons couldn't reach. It was risky. If it failed, he'd die on the table. But if we did nothing, he'd die anyway. I told them about the 18-hour surgery, how I'd meticulously grafted vessels from his leg to create new pathways around the blocked arteries, how his heart had stopped twice during the procedure, and how we'd managed to get it beating again, how I'd stayed with him in the ICU for 3 days straight, monitoring every heartbeat, adjusting medications, watching for signs of complications. When he finally woke up, I said, the first thing he asked was, "Who saved my life?" The nurses told him it was Dr. Marchand, and he said he wanted to thank me personally. We talked for hours about his recovery, his medications, what his life would look like going forward. My father was shaking his head slowly. Sophia, I had no idea. We had no idea you were doing work like this. Dad, I've been trying to tell you for years, but every time I brought up my career, you changed the subject back to how I'd wasted my law school opportunity. The conversation continued late into the evening. I found myself sharing stories I'd never told them, about other patients I'd saved, about research I was conducting, about the respect I'd earned from my colleagues. I told them about Maria Santos, the ICU nurse who'd worked with me during my residency and who still called me for advice on difficult cases. I told them about Professor Williams from Harvard, who had actually supported my decision to switch to medicine and had written one of my medical school recommendation letters. You stayed in touch with Professor Williams? Marcus asked, surprised. Of course I did. He was one of the few people who understood that leaving law school wasn't giving up. It was finding my true calling. As the evening wore on, I watched my family's perception of me transform in real time. The disappointment in their eyes was gradually being replaced by something that looked like pride, mixed with guilt for having misjudged me so completely. But the real moment of closure came when I reached into my purse and pulled out something I'd been carrying for 8 years. My Harvard Law School acceptance letter. It was worn and creased from being folded and unfolded so many times, but the words were still clear. I've kept this, I said, placing it on the table between us. For 8 years, I've carried this around like some kind of reminder of who I was supposed to be. My mother picked up the letter with trembling hands. Sophia, why do you still have this? Because for the longest time, I thought maybe you were right. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I should have stuck with law school, should have become the person you wanted me to be, instead of the person I was meant to be. I took the letter back from my mother and looked at it one more time. The letterhead was still crisp, the congratulatory language still formal and impressive. Harvard Law School is pleased to offer you admission to our Juris Doctor program. But today, I continued, when Judge Harrison recognized me, when he told everyone that I'd saved his life, I realized something. This letter represents a path I didn't take, but that doesn't make it a failure. It makes it a choice. I chose to save lives instead of argue cases, and that choice has defined who I've become. Without ceremony, I tore the letter in half, then in half again. My family watched in stunned silence as I let the pieces fall onto the table like confetti. I don't need this anymore, I said. I don't need your approval to know that I made the right choice. I've saved hundreds of lives. I've contributed to medical research that will help thousands more. I've built a career that matters to me, even if it took you 8 years to understand that it should matter to you too. My father reached across the table and covered my hand with his. For the first time in years, his touch felt warm instead of disappointed. Sophia, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I owe you an apology. We all do. We were so focused on the path we'd chosen for you that we completely missed the incredible path you'd chosen for yourself. My mother was crying openly now. We called you a quitter, she whispered. But you're the strongest person I know. You gave up something prestigious to follow your heart, and look what you've accomplished. Marcus, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke up. Sis, I want you to know something. Today, when Judge Harrison was talking about you, I've never been prouder to be someone's brother. You didn't just save his life, you've probably saved hundreds of lives. What you do matters more than anything I'll ever do in a courtroom." The restaurant had grown quiet around us as the evening wound down, but our conversation continued. We talked about missed opportunities for connection, about assumptions and expectations, about the difference between the life your family wants for you and the life you want for yourself. As we prepared to leave, Judge Harrison's words echoed in my mind. "Your family should be incredibly proud of you." For the first time in 8 years, I believed they actually were. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages. Word had spread quickly through my extended family about what had happened at the courthouse. Cousins, aunts, uncles, people who had whispered about my failure for years, were now reaching out to congratulate me. But the call that mattered most came from my father at 7 a.m. "Sophia," he said when I answered, "I've been up all night thinking about yesterday, about everything we missed, everything we got wrong. I want to make this right." "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. I'm calling everyone. Everyone who ever heard us talk about you as a disappointment. I'm telling them the truth about who you really are, about what you've accomplished. My daughter isn't a Harvard Law dropout. She's Dr. Sophia Marchand, cardiac surgeon, lifesaver, hero." 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the annual Boston Medical Conference, delivering a keynote speech about innovative cardiac procedures. In the third row, my entire family sat beaming with pride. My father had brought a stack of business cards with my name and credentials to hand out to anyone who would listen. My mother had started a scrapbook of my medical achievements. 8 years' worth of accomplishments she was finally ready to celebrate. Judge Harrison, fully recovered and back on the bench, had become something of a family friend. He'd even officiated when Marcus got married last month, and in his remarks, he'd talked about the importance of family, not just blood family, but chosen family, people who see you for who you really are. That night at the restaurant, when I tore up my Harvard Law acceptance letter, I thought I was just disposing of a symbol of a path not taken. But I realize now that I was doing something much more important. I was finally accepting myself, with or without their approval. The little girl who had once desperately wanted her parents to be proud of her had grown into a woman who was proud of herself. And sometimes that's the most important transformation of all. As I looked out at my family in that conference audience, I saw something I'd never seen before in their eyes when they looked at me. Unconditional pride. Not pride in who they wanted me to be, but pride in who I had become. It only took 8 years and a chance encounter with a judge whose life I'd saved, but we finally got there, and it was worth the wait.